Today you will be watching Research the Science in Psychology, Part 1.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we're going to begin a new section of our lectures. Today we are going to be talking about the importance of being able to choose a research design. Generally, when we talk about choosing our design, there's many elements that we need to take into consideration before we get started in that process. Mainly, we like to focus on that research question that is going to lead us into being able to select a research design, I should say, amongst other things. So let's get started. Let's talk about the importance that relies and it involves designing and selecting that design. Well, it's relevant for us to study and conduct a study because it allows you to conduct observations using the scientific method, using the scientific process to answer a research question. Keep in mind that we do have other methods to come to know what we know. So for example, we could use intuition, we could use authority. But the problem is that these methods of knowing do not involve the scientific method. Therefore, they could be prone to a large margin of error. They could be prone to bias. So that's why we are interested in conducting studies here in psychology and other behavioral sciences, because we want to mitigate the chances of aspects being influenced by bias. Generally, the type of study that you are conducting will depend on that question that you are asking. What does that mean? Well, let's think about a question that sounds like a correlation. Let's talk about a question, an issue that you guys have observed. What can you guys tell me? What's an issue that you guys have observed, whether it be in behavior or mental health or leadership, anything like that? Who would like to bring up a concern that they have observed, either by experience or read about it? You can tell me about a concern. Say, for example, not having, and that's a good one. There aren't that many Spanish-speaking providers in the state of Alabama. There aren't. My understanding, there's only roughly about 18. That's it. There's only about 18 providers that can provide mental health services in Spanish. When I mean that, I mean individual therapy, right? Now, I have observed that issue. Now, I want to turn that observation into a question and say, what are the impacts? So what is the relationship, for example? Let's do that. What is the relationship between the amount of Spanish-speaking providers in this state? What is the relationship between that and clients/patients seeking help? Notice that my question is a relationship, right? I'm trying to study the relationship between one and the other, which will tell me the type of study I will conduct, meaning I'm going to conduct a correlation because I'm trying to look for the relationship. If I'm looking for the cause of something, right? If I'm looking, what is it that can lead and can cause a second factor? So for instance, let's think about, many people ask this question, right? They'll say, what led this person into being a serial killer, right? So that doesn't sound like a correlation. That sounds more like a cause of something. What caused this person? What had that impact that led that person into a life of murder and crime? Now, of course, that would be multiple factors that would go into it, right? It wouldn't be like one variable that impacted that behavior. But notice that type of question sounds more like an experiment, right? Or a quasi-experiment, if you will. When I am talking about research design, I am talking about what is that specific method? What is that specific procedure that I am going to utilize in order to answer this question? What type of procedure, what type of methods I'm going to in place in order to accurately or more fittingly, let's say, answer that research question, right? So when I say fittingly, think about if I'm looking for a correlation, then a relationship, that means that the research design should be a correlation. If I have control of that independent variable and I'm looking for a cause, we'll do an experiment. I don't have control of that independent variable, we may be looking at a quasi-experiment approach. Now, there are many different types of research. And in these types, we're going to talk about exploratory, descriptive, or relational. Any questions so far as to why selecting a research design is important? What is the intent of a research design? What can we use to come up with a research design, which is the question. The type of question is going to lead us into selecting that accurate or more fitting, I should say, research design. Fantastic. Any questions from our live audience? Right. Good deal. Let's talk about exploratory. Let's talk about exploratory design. Within an exploratory design, I want to know and explore that area in which generally that research or that factor is not well understood, right? So when you hear the word explore, I want you to think about that probably means that we don't have much knowledge about the topic, right? So every time you hear a type of question, for example, what happens with student enrollment? What if Corona is impacting student enrollment, right? That would be an exploratory type of question because we don't know much of that yet. So sure, you can think about a descriptive or a relational type of question. But if I don't know what the phenomenon looks like, then how am I to do statistics upon it, right? So I like to think about it that way. So whenever we're thinking about exploratory, think about I'm exploring something, like I'm exploring new land or I'm exploring a new forest, right? Something that a pioneer that hasn't perhaps noted or discovered, or we don't know much information. Let's move on to descriptive. Any questions about the exploratory type of question? All right, good deal. Let's move on to descriptive. This is when you're going to start asking questions of what is blank or how does blank what? I'm trying to characterize, I'm trying to describe the variables that are related to a specific group of individuals. Right? So I'm trying to describe the variables specific to a group of individuals. Now, one of that could be how many pounds does a college student typically gain in his or her first freshman year? I can answer that question. When I was a freshman, I gained like 40 pounds. I was getting too thick, too much. There is a limit. This is too much. I was itty bitty. It was very tiny. So the answer to that question is a lot. I am describing what I am seeing. Now, let's move towards relational. And we already spoke about it a little bit. We are asking questions that will begin with does or is, because we are interested in finding out, in determining if there is a relationship between variables. if there's a relationship between variables. So think about, is there a relationship between CBT therapy and reduction of OCD symptoms? That would be trying to find that relationship between the type of treatment modality versus the symptoms. And if you remember from your recent paper, that is exactly what you did. We're looking into treatment modalities and therapy modalities as they impacted that dependent variable in your article. So you guys actually were looking into aspects like these. Any questions so far? Good deal. Fantastic. Now, this here is a really good summary, and I'm going to show it on screen. This here is an excellent summary of what we just discussed. We have the research design, the different types of questions that we may encounter. Let's talk about a little bit about that experimental side of things. Within the experimental design, we are looking into finding causes. If you don't take anything else from the experimental design, I need you to remember that an experimental design implies knowing or determining, finding out what the cause is. So just like the example that I gave you, we have a serial killer, and I'm trying to find out the cause that led to that serial killing behavior. However, I cannot control the cause. In that case, I'm moving towards a quasi-experimental design. Notice that these two are very similar. They truly are. They're very similar. The process is the same. Variables tend to look the same. The main difference, if you don't learn anything from the quasi-experimental approach, is that in an experiment, I can manipulate that independent variable. In a quasi-experiment, I cannot. I cannot manipulate that independent variable. And I'm going to give you a reasonable or an example. Let's think about, you are interested in finding out what leads to predatory sexual behavior, right? For example, you're interested in finding out what can cause or what can lead for a person to commit a sexual assault, right? You wouldn't be able to control that variable. It will be unethical for one, right? It will be unethical. So I cannot control, say, for example, the individual says, well, I engage in this sexual assault because I myself have been a survivor of a sexual assault. So notice, I cannot, as a researcher, impart that kind of harm upon you. So the next best thing would be, because it needs to be studied, right? We don't want to ignore it because we cannot manipulate that variable, right? But we would like to move into a quasi-experiment. I cannot manipulate it, but what would be the next best thing? So the next best thing would be sampling from a population that reports that sexual assault. That would be the next factor. So I can control it. I'll give you another example. Say I want to study PTSD on the survivors of serious hurricanes, for example, Katrina here in the mainland, or Hurricane Maria in US territories like Puerto Rico. Notice I can't create a hurricane. I can't do that. So I cannot manipulate that independent variable. So the next best thing would be I can recruit from a sample that has indeed survived that type of natural disaster. So survivors from Louisiana, survivors from Puerto Rico, So that would be the next best thing. That's what we would know as a quasi-experiment. Any questions about the differences between the experimental and the quasi-experimental approach? We also have another method. And in this case, I want you to look at the non-experimental approach. Non-experimental generally implies a description. We're trying to find out and understand variables that may predict that relationship, that may predict that behavior, perhaps. Any questions about that? So notice that your research question helped you in selecting one of these methods. Can I control the independent variable? You're going for an experiment. I cannot control that independent variable. We're going for a quasi-experiment, and if I can, and if I'm looking for a description, then my best choice would be non-experimental. Interestingly, when I say being able to control that independent variable, if I can manipulate it, that refers to, am I able to manipulate that variable while I hold everything else constant? What does that mean exactly? Remember that in an experiment, you have a lot of control. You are controlling. Let's move to an example of, I like using medication because I feel like that one's really easy to understand and follow. If I'm conducting an experiment, and my question is, can this medication reduce the symptoms of, let's say, OCD? I can control the amount, the dose. I can control what time of day you take it. I can control what you eat. I can control if you are or are not taking other medications. So notice that there is a lot of control in an experiment. Whereas in a quasi-experiment is almost the same, with the difference that I cannot control that independent variable. So for instance, I cannot control creating a hurricane, right? But I can control everything else. For example, recruiting from the same place, same age group, I can control how we measure that dependent variable of trauma, perhaps PTSD. So notice there is also a lot of control, but we're missing control of that independent variable. So that leads me into a quasi-experiment. A non-experimental approach, on the other hand, I have a little bit less of control because now I'm not looking for cause. So I'm looking for this relationship. I cannot hold all other variables constant necessarily. Any questions about what control is and how it can lead me to selecting the different categories of research design? Any questions about that? Fantastic. Now, when we are talking about an experimental research design, this is a method in which the researcher has full control of those conditions. We're trying to understand if the procedures that I'm using to make this observation do lead me into the control of that experience that you are having. Right? So if you go back to the medication, I am in full control of the amount of milligrams. I am controlled about the different aspects of that study. But I want you to know that it's not only the control, right? I know we're talking a lot about control, but there's also other aspects. We are required to apply 3 elements in order to say, okay, I do indeed have control of my study. One of them is randomization. manipulation, and comparison and control. Notice that because of these elements, an experiment is the only design that would allow you to have a determination of cause and effect. Why is that? Because if I take control about all these elements, I can, with a certain level of certainty, say it was my medication that allowed the reduction of these symptoms. It wasn't luck. It wasn't mere chance. It wasn't because this person was going to therapy and taking the medication. Notice that I can control for that too. You're not going to you're not going to therapy. We're going to measure to see if it happened by chance, that you actually started feeling better naturally, right? Without any sort of intervention. So we're talking about randomization, and I believe we've talked a little bit about that before. But when we are in very generic, very general terms, I should say, randomization will refer, I should say, to both the random selection of those participants, and not only that, the random assignment of those participants. So randomization will refer to randomly selecting those participants and later on randomly assigning them to whether or not they're going to be part of that experimental group or they're going to be part of that control group, which leads me into my third element. That third element. So first we had randomization, which means pulling from and assigning randomly. Manipulation. Can I indeed control that independent variable? And comparison and control. What do I need comparison and control? I need comparison and control because once I assign randomly people to this comparison or experimental and I assign people to this control group, notice that I want to observe if there are in fact differences between these two groups, and not only that, are they significant? Because for all we know, yeah, it could be a difference, but was it different enough? Was this difference significant enough that it led for us to say, yes, the cause of the symptom reduction was indeed the medication? And if I have a control group that is not being impacted by this treatment, I could observe, say, for example, if that reduction happened naturally, if it just so happens that their symptoms were reduced. Any questions about that? All right, good deal. Good deal. Now, something that I need to mention is that there's a key element in regards to experimental approaches, and that is strength. It's basically our capability to demonstrate and show that there is, in fact, a cause and effect. As I mentioned, this change could have happened randomly. This change could have happened because, say, for example, personality traits of the individual. Now, experiments sound great, right? We can't control the factors. We can't control variable, manipulate that variable. We can select people at random, so we increase the chances that everybody's represented equally, right? You don't want to sample just the people who are having a hard time with their OCD and then neglecting those that are not having a rough time. You want to make sure that everybody's represented in that group because we want to make sure that we have all sides, that we don't have an outlier, a statistic or a participant that is absolutely off the chart. We want to find that center. The only way we're going to find that average is by everybody being represented. There is a limitation, however. One of the main limitations is that behavior that occurs in such a controlled environment may not necessarily be that same behavior that occurs in a natural environment. And I'll give you a great example. When you go to the club and have a good time, or go to the bar, or go to the cookout, whatever you do, you don't behave the same way there as you would in front of your parents. I know I would, right? Why is that? Because we are in a controlled setting, right? We have that researcher, i.e. mom and dad, right? And these people are part of that control study, right? They are controlling our behavior. We want to do certain things a certain way. But in your natural habitat, you're a party animal, right? So that information that we are receiving in a controlled environment may not necessarily apply in that natural environment. So that is one of the limitations of experiments. The setting is controlled to the extent that it may or may not represent the natural behavior or the variables in their natural environment. Any questions about that? All right, good deal. Now, within the experimental approach, are there any questions from our online audience? Okay. Within the experimental approach, we're going to come up with different categories and different research designs. So let's talk about single case design. When we are talking about a single case design, we are looking into studying that one element, right? That one group, right? That one individual, if you will. We're only studying one factor at a time. When we move into the within subjects design, we're trying to see if there were any differences within that group, within the group. So let's say we have a group of students who do a little bar chart over here. I promise you this is a bar chart, promise. So we have our little bar chart, and within subjects, we have many participants, right? This bar represents many participants within it. So within a subject's design, I'm looking for the differences in each and one of these participants within this category. So category 1, category 2, category 3. When we move on to the between subjects design, now I'm not focused on that single category, right? I'm not focused in that single group. Now, what I am focused on, I'm going to look at those differences between one category, one group, I should say, to the next. So I'm trying to find out, are there differences between these participants and these participants? Are the differences between here, this group? So notice that we moved away from that individual participant. Now we're moving outside of that group. Now the next design is a factorial design. And as the term suggests, we are looking at multiple factors, right? We're looking at perhaps not just that one variable, but now we're looking at 2, 3, perhaps. And there's specific designs that apply depending on the amount of variables you have. There's different studies you can do. But in a factorial design, you're looking into these factors that influence that dependent variable. So not just the factor, these factors that influence my dependent variable. Any questions about that? Fantastic. If you notice within the factorial design, we can conduct a wide variety. So we can do our within, we can do our between, and we can do a mixed, right? So we can have all of these together. Any questions about that? Good deal. Now, we talked about the experimental design, the elements that tell me that this is indeed an experiment and that it is controlled, is randomized, and have a control and experimental group. We talked about the limitations of an experiment. So let's move on to our second type of study. And we're going to talk about a quasi-experimental research design. For those of you who speak Spanish, it's funny because quasi sounds a lot like the word casi in Spanish, which is almost, right? So this is almost an experiment, right? I like to remember that. I use that as a little trick, like, oh, quasi sounds like quasi. So, oh yeah, it's almost an experiment. That's exactly it. It's almost a true experiment. And why is that? Because we are using the same methods. We are using the same procedures as you would in a true experiment, but I'm lacking control. Generally in the form of, I cannot manipulate this independent variable, right? So I like to think about quasi, I like to think like, oh, it's quasi, right? Quasi means almost in Spanish. So I like to think about, oh, this is almost an experiment. So basically it looks, we can try to have a control group, we can try to have an experimental group, we can do things very similar to a true experiment. But the problem is we are going to lack some of that control. See, you learned Spanish today. Look at that. We're a multifaceted group over here. Now, generally, when we are talking about a quasi-independent variable, we are referring to any factor that is pre-existing, right? Any factor that is pre-existing. Let me delete this a little bit. So when we're talking about a quasi-independent variable, we're talking about something that is pre-existing. For example, the fact that you survived Hurricane Katrina, that is pre-existing. I did not give you that manipulation. You were not given a pill. I didn't give you, here's some hurricane, here you go. That would be impossible, right? That means that you as a participant, you come in with that variable, with that characteristic. One of them is gender. You come in with your gender, male, female, non-binary. I cannot assign you your gender. I cannot say, okay, so for this study, you're gonna be a man, and for this study, you're gonna be female, right? That would be impossible on my end. You come in with that characteristic. Weight is another one. I like to think about mental illness as another quasi-independent variable, right? I cannot give you trauma. I cannot give you PTSD. I cannot give you OCD, right? So I like to think about mental illness. That's also a quasi-independent variable because you came in with that for my research, right? You had that characteristic, so you came in with that. Let's talk about the strengths that come with a quasi-experimental approach. Interestingly, because of this quasi-independent variable, it allows me to observe unique characteristics of that participant. It allows me to see something that belongs to you. So this quasi-independent variable allows me to observe unique characteristics, right? So for example, I cannot put you through the process of surviving a hurricane, but that came with the unique characteristic that you are indeed the survivor of a hurricane or a tornado or something like that. So notice that because you came in with that characteristic, it is unique. Now, this is where we have our limitation. Remember that quasi means almost, right? In my head, it's almost an experiment. And because it's almost an experiment and it's not a true experiment, I am unable to demonstrate cause and effect. That is the main downfall of a quasi-experimental approach. Because I was unable to control for this independent variable, it was very close, man, almost an experiment, but we're not. Therefore, if we're not a true experiment, I cannot tell you the cause of that trauma. I can say, here's an individual who survived Hurricane Katrina, someone who survived a mass shooting, for example, school shooting. That is an individual unique characteristic, but I cannot with 100% certainty say your trauma was caused by that active shooter experience. Your trauma wasn't caused by, say, for example, that hurricane survival, right? Because I lack that control of that independent variable. Any questions about that? Notice that in social sciences, this is going to be your baby. Generally, everything we do in social sciences, I cannot give you, right? I cannot give you trauma. I cannot give you survival. I cannot give you depression. So you're going to see that a lot of the studies that we conduct here in mental health tend to be quasi-experimental. Sure, there is a limitation of cause and effect, but its benefit is that I can study unique characteristics of this individual. Now, we have different methods. We have different methods within that quasi-experimental approach. We can observe, for example, a one-group design. What does that mean? We have one group. Let's think about Hurricane Katrina survivors. So we have one group, and we can conduct, say, for example, a test. We have post-test and pre-test designs. So with the post-test, I can say, I'm going to give you therapy, this treatment modality for my Hurricane Katrina survivors. And TX is generally the abbreviation for therapy, by the way, for those of you who didn't know. And I'm going to identify if this therapy allowed you, after my post-test, it allowed to demonstrate a reduction of symptoms. So this will be my examination, my test after therapy. So this will be considered a post-test. I only did that assessment after that treatment modality was imparted upon the participants. Pre-test is the same concept, but beforehand. So instead of giving you the test and the assessment after, right? I'm going to give you that assessment after therapy. I'm going to give you that assessment before. Now that design will look like this. Test, right, before the treatment of the persons who survived hurricane. So now it was before. That's what we call a pre-test design. Now we can have a pre-test post-test. And that would mean that I'm going to give you, which is generally what's more advisable. So I'm going to give you an assessment before therapy. So we have our T, our test, and then we have our assessment after therapy. So we did it first, then therapy, then again, the same assessment. Generally, this is a really good method because it allows us to see whether or not there was a difference. If there was a difference between now, so say you had a score, say, I'll make up a number, let's do 17, and after, let's say, 6 months of therapy, you scored a 9. So the only way I could do this comparison, right, that reduction of symptoms would be that I did a pre-test and post-test. Any questions about that? All right. Now, we do have other methods. We have a time series, and a time series is when we have an interrupted design. So basically, there was some sort of gap between that research. We also have a developmental design, And I think someone mentioned earlier their interest in developmental psychology. I see you. Hey. So here we are looking at a longitudinal study. Longitudinal, as the term suggests, long is right there in the word, which means this is a very long-term study. This means this study will be conducted, it will be observed throughout a large span of time. It could be from birth till the day you die, and you're going to be part of this study because we want to observe, say, for example, issues of your development. So say, I want to observe you between when you were, let's say, 18 and were accepted in college, and I'm going to observe you all the way until you graduate, say at 22. This would be considered longitudinal because it was a couple of years before we concluded our study. I want to see your development in this time, during this time. That may be a little, not only time consuming, it could be immensely expensive to conduct that type of research, which is why we can move to something similar, which is the cross-sectional sequential type of study. So notice that with that group of people, imagine if it's just one guy. Imagine if I wanted to study 100 people between the time they were accepted in college to the time they graduated. Imagine if it's 1,000 people, 3,000 people. Notice that it's going to be really expensive and time consuming. So then I'm going to move to my cross-sectional cohort, which is, say, I can observe the 18-year-olds, I can observe 19, 20, all the way up of them being 21, 22, I should say. This took less time, but I'm still observing that long progression, but with different participants, different cohorts, if you will. A cohort of 18, cohort of 19, cohort of 20, 21, and 22. So this would take less time because I am observing different cohorts that are sequential to each other. Now we can also have aspects that we have no equivalency, And in this specific regard, notice that we have similarities to our one group, but the difference is that this group here, there's not necessarily an equivalency between the groups, right? So we don't have that match, if you will. So I'll give you an example. Say in one group, I had 1,000 participants, and in this group, I only had 500. The variables might have been different. For example, this 18-year-old went to University of Texas, and then this 19-year-old went to University of California, so on and so forth. Any questions about the quasi-experimental designs? All right, good deal. Now, I like to think about non-experimental designs, and that is our third design. We talked about experimental, quasi-experimental. Let's talk about non-experimental. And in this specific case, in our non-experimental design, we are doing observations as is, without intervention. I like to think about this as observing you in your natural habitat. That's what I prefer to call it. If you take nothing from the non-experimental design, is that both the conditions and the participants are not manipulated. They are not manipulated. Something immensely important about non-experimental design is that because you are observing things as they are, so for example, I want to observe flirting behaviors amongst college age participants at the club. Best way to do that is for me to go to a club where a lot of college age people go to flirt, right? So I wouldn't be able to do that type of study here, right? So I need to move to that habitat, if you will. I need to go where that behavior is observed. Therefore, its main strength is that I can observe naturally. I can observe those events, those people, how they naturally operate. The way, for example, if I'm interested in flirting behaviors, the way that you will flirt in the library is not going to look the same way if you are at the club at 2 a.m. It's not. Therefore, I am able to observe you naturally. But because I am observing you naturally, that it's also its demise, that it's also its downfall, because now I am lacking the control to demonstrate cause and effect. What does that mean? So let's suppose that I'm conducting this study and I want to study the flirting behaviors of college-age students, their natural habitat. Because I don't have control of the club, of the flirting behavior. Who do you talk to? How long do you talk to them? What do you say to them? Because I have no control of this and I am observing your natural habitat, I cannot tell you what led to that flirting behavior of the club. Therefore, I am unable to determine cause and effect. I can't control for anything. You control for if you buy a drink, if you eat, I can't control any of those things because I want to observe you naturally. Therefore, its benefit, it's also its limitation. I cannot tell you exactly what led to the flirting because I had no control over that situation. Yes, ma'am.
So, what can you tell from the bit?
I'm sorry?
What can you tell from the bit?
I can tell a description of what I saw.
Okay.
And it's important. So the question was, what can I tell, right? What can I actually tell about a non-experimental approach? I can describe the event. I can describe this event with a systematic scientific observation, right? So if we have no idea what leads to flirting or what problems can come from flirting, I need to first be able to describe it before I can actually start dealing with problems, for example, loneliness or shyness or things of that nature. But I'm not able to conduct, say, another type of study because I don't even know what flirting in the club looks like. So the objective would be, I need to be able to observe so that I can describe. I like to think of it in very antique medicine. You know, back in the day, they had no idea, you know, what a brain looked like, right? But then they decided, okay, let me open up and see what this looks like. I cannot operate in the brain if I don't know what it looks like. So I like to think of it as that researcher, that medical researcher that was looking at body parts and saying, okay, this connects to that, therefore, and I have a description. Once we have the description, we can move into other aspects. Does that answer your question? Yes, thank you. Right. Any questions from our robot audience? See you. Any questions from you? All right. Good deal. Let's talk about the types of non-experimental approaches. Let's think about quantitative. Actually, I'm going to do it the opposite way. Let's do qualitative. I feel that qualitative should always come first. So let's do that. Let's do qualitative first. Qualitative sounds an awful lot like what? Like quality. So if I'm looking into qualities, I'm looking to provide a description of these characteristics. Qualitative involves the qualities, the characteristics of that phenomenon. I'm looking into describing what exactly this phenomenon is. So in regards to those qualities, I can conduct a phenomenology study, I can do an ethnography study, and I can do a case study. let's talk about looking into a phenomenon. In this case, we are looking at something generally that's brand new, generally something we don't know much about. It's a new phenomenon. So for example, depression that comes from surviving COVID, which interestingly, you guys know that I practice under supervision, and there has been an increase of people showing up to practice saying, this was awful. I still live with the fear that I'm going to die because I had COVID. So now they're going to therapy thinking, I've never had anxiety before. I've never had depression before. I've never had phobias or fears about dying. And I'm here at the office today. That is a new phenomenon. That is something that we would need to learn how to describe, those characteristics, those qualities. When we're thinking about an ethnography, we're thinking about specifically a group of people, right? A culture. So I like to think about those high-speed researchers that found out about this new place, about this new tribe or a group of people that we have no knowledge about. So the phenomena in it by itself is the culture, right? So that researcher will observe that group of people with the idea that we're looking into the culture. We're looking into discovering things that we had not discovered before. It is an unknown. Therefore, we want to look at the qualities of this unknown. And a case study. Has anyone here heard the term case study when it comes to research? All right. Would you like to share what that is?
I just know it to be like, like an example, like the person like they experienced it, it's like in the book,
Okay. Generally, a case study involves an immensely unique case. It involves someone, generally just one person, because sometimes you can see like 2, 3 people, but generally is one person that has gone through an experience, an event, or has a characteristic that is immensely unique. It is rare. So I can show you guys an example of a case study. I do want to tell you that it involves aspect of death, child neglect, child abuse. So if that is something you do not want to hear about, I highly welcome you to, for example, leave the room, wear headphones, whatever it is that you need to do to take care of yourself. I'm going to pull up an example of a case study. Going to be really loud so that the camera can pick up the image and the sound. So case studies are important because it allows us and it gives us an insight upon something that is not well known or a unique characteristic about something that we have not seen or that it's immensely rare for it to occur.
In 1970, in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles, a harrowing story came to light. It would change forever our understanding of how a child's brain develops. A social worker discovered a 13-year-old girl who was still in diapers and whimpered like an animal.
Clearly something was terribly wrong. She didn't speak. She was completely unkempt. She could hardly walk. She could hardly balance.
Jeannie, as the child was named, had suffered a most horrific ordeal.
We learned after she was found from interviews with her mother, from some drawings that Jeannie made, that she had been kept isolated in a room at the back of a house. In this room there was a potty seat to which she had been harnessed without any clothes, just naked, and left to sit there day and night. She was in this room for 12 and a half years.
Jeannie's father was mentally unstable. He had decided to hide his daughter from the world.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charges. We haven't even seen them.
Jeannie's parents were both charged with willful abuse. 15 minutes before he was due in court, her father put a gun to his head. But the damage to Jeannie was done. She had spent her childhood in almost total isolation. Her brain had been deprived of a nurturing environment and left to grow in solitude. The effect was devastating. Jeannie had the mental age of an 18-month-old infant, unable to talk. But to science, she offered a unique opportunity, a chance to separate the effects of nature and nurture on a child's brain. The big question was, would Jeannie be able to catch up? Susie Curtis was a young linguist when she got the job of looking after Jeannie 5 days a week.
She was hard to be with. She did not know how to swallow very well, so she would salivate and just spit. So I would come home drenched in her saliva. There were lots of things that were very, very difficult and unpleasant, but nonetheless, she was just entirely captivating. The way she moved her hands, the way she just moved her body and her face, her eyes, that just seemed to be incredibly expressive and hold the world within them.
Susie soon discovered that Jeannie was highly intelligent and extremely curious about the world.
I was really hopeful because she was just insatiable. She wanted to know the word for everything. And her assumption was that everything had its own label. Every shade of color had its own label. And so she wanted to learn the label for everything in her world. It's dark, yes. She continued to develop a huge vocabulary. I could no longer keep track of what she knew. And she continued to be able to string words together. Buy applesauce store, or buy more applesauce store, which meant buy more applesauce at the store.
Oh, Mama.
Let me see, the log?
Oh, Mama.
But the little bits and pieces of English that take those words and transform them into a grammatical sentence never came in. All the question words like who, what, where, why, when, never. She never had any of them. Pronouns like he, she, it, they, him, her, not in her vocabulary.
Here, you do it. Put them in the box.
And so despite all the years that I was with her, where I saw lots of growth in lots of other areas, she didn't ever learn the grammar of English.
Jeannie never worked out the fundamental rules of language. Her brain had missed a critical stage of its development. In the first years of life, the main job of the brain is to make sure all the brain cells are wired up correctly. Surprisingly, it's not just a matter of making connections, but cutting them. A 3-year-old has twice as many connections between brain cells as a grown-up, and they're jumbled and chaotic. To work properly, the brain must decide which connections to keep and which ones to cut. Trillions of connections need to be checked. So the brain uses a brutal but effective rule. Use it or lose it. Because Jeannie's parents hardly ever spoke to her, the parts of her brain responsible for grammar were not stimulated and were crippled for life. Jeannie's story did not have a happy ending. She went through a string of foster homes, was abused in one of them, and stopped talking altogether. She now lives in a care home in California. Jeannie's experience was extreme, But her case taught science that once a critical window of brain development has passed, there is no going back. A growing brain is both vulnerable and extreme.
So when we are thinking about a case study, notice that in this specific case, this child was basically in a room by herself, tied to a chair in which she was tied up to spend every day on that chair. And if you saw the chair involved at an area in which she could relieve herself, she could defecate, she could urinate, but she didn't receive that interaction when it comes to language because her parents wouldn't speak to her. And then on top of that, if you add neglect, all sorts of factors, nutrition and everything like that, notice that in her specific case, she was unable to correctly learn how to speak because we had missed significant milestones in order for her to say, being able to connect words and turn them into a sentence or pronouns. What makes this a case study? Well, first of all, her experience was unique. It's an unfortunate, unique experience. It gave us insight as to how our brain develops when it comes to learning a language development. But notice that I couldn't turn this into an experiment because that would involve that I keep a child in a room for 13 years and see what happens, right? So I wouldn't be able to do that. The best case scenario for us to understand something like this would be through the evaluation of a case study. A case study, remember, is qualitative. Qualitative involves qualities. Therefore, I am studying the qualities of this child. What characteristics, for example, child abuse and neglect, led to her lack of development when it came to language? Any questions about both a phenomenon, ethnic, or case study when it comes to qualitative research? All right. Good deal. Let's move into a quantitative approach. So let's say I understand the phenomena, right? I've been able to describe that phenomena. I know that I have, for instance, the description of this phenomena. I know what it looks like, right? So I know what this phenomenon looks like. Now we can start looking at this in a numeric sense, if you will. So if qualitative sounds like qualities and characteristics, quantitative sounds like quantity. So now we can move, now that I have learned how to describe this phenomena, I'm going to move towards the quantitative side. So notice that within the quantitative approach, we are moving into the area of correlational, or let's move back to the previous one. Let's do this. Let's move towards existing data. Which, by the way, if you ever have to write a thesis or a dissertation, that's probably what you want to go for because the data exists, right? It's in a little box, you know, with a little bow on top of it. You don't have to collect data. Wait. If I learned anything, is that the best paper is a finished paper, isn't it? The best paper is a finished paper. You don't have to deal with it anymore. But when I say that, it's because we have existing data, I should say. With existing data, as the term suggests, I have that information available to me already. So I can do a content analysis. I can look into archives and conduct a research and look into information that's already available to me, for example, in a library search, or I can conduct a meta-analysis. And meta as it suggests, is pretty meta. What does that mean, right? It means that in a meta-analysis, I am looking into similar research questions in the literature, right? You guys have conducted your literature searches before within PsycInfo and databases. And for those of you who are watching, we will conduct a library search in order to find articles that have the same research question. So let's say we are looking into marriage difficulty and OCD, right? And we look into thousands of articles that have the same research question. Right? What is the relationship? Is there a relationship between severe symptoms of OCD and marriage satisfaction, right? We can indeed have numeric values for that, and we can also have numeric values for marriage satisfaction. So now I can look into the literature and find out how many articles have studied this before. And say you come across dozens, if not hundreds, of articles that are asking the same exact question, you would conduct a meta-analysis, because now you're going to group together all of those articles and that research question and find out if there is indeed the same consistent result, right? Did they all find a similar or the same thing? That would show me that statistically, that research question and those methods work out, that there is in fact or not a relationship between severe symptoms of OCD and marriage satisfaction. That's what a meta-analysis is. Generally someone who is an expert in that field, will review hundreds of research articles that involve that same research question. And then he puts it in a little box and look, I read all these articles. Here you go. This is what I found. Isn't that great? Somebody actually sat down and did that. So any questions about these? Fantastic. Let's move towards a correlational study. Now, we've mentioned these before. Correlation, you're looking for a relationship. Is there a relationship between being unfaithful and vicarious trauma? We can find that through a correlation, because I'm trying to find out if vicarious trauma had an impact upon unfaithful behavior. Or I shouldn't say impact, that's more experiment, I should say relationship. Now, in naturalistic survey, within the naturalistic survey, we are moving towards gathering that data, huh? Both in the correlational and naturalistic, you are gathering that data. You're gathering those participants. I want you to fill out the survey. I want you to tell me about, say, for example, your experience with your research class, with yours truly fantastic, highly motivated, innovative Dr. Shaw. So you're going to get that survey and you're going to answer these questions. That will be new data. Right? That will be new data that we're collecting. Any questions about that? Good deal. Now, if there are no questions, I will end our lecture right here. Thank you for watching.